Welcome to the Wheel of Time Diaries. I'm your host, King Crusoe, but you can call me KC, and this week, the fourth and not quite final episode of the Wheel of Time Diaries for Book 7 of the series, the penultimate episode on A Crown of Swords. We're going to be covering chapters 28 through, is it 36, I believe? Yes, chapters 28 through 36 of the book is what we're covering today. Over the past week, I didn't quite get to finish the book, but of course I predicted this a couple of weeks back in episode 2, maybe, in the book, when I was saying that I got to be halfway through the book in just 2 episodes, but I didn't think I would be able to keep up that pace. That turned out being true. The last couple of weeks of February have been kind of crazy with other non-YouTube related stuff going on for me, which has heavily affected my ability to actually read this book over the weekends and therefore get up to my previously allotted spaces that I was hoping to, so I had to split things out a little bit differently for these last few episodes. Last week I spent about 6 hours reading, a little over 6 hours reading, and over the course of this more recent week, I guess I should have said the week before last week before, but I spent another 6 hours reading over the past 7 days at the time that you're seeing this video, which puts my total reading time for A Crown of Swords at just about 28 and a half hours grand total. I am on page, what is it at this point, like 560 something out of about 650 pages, so I only have about 90 pages left for next week to cover, which is a good bit less than any of the 4 weeks up to this point have already covered. For the spoiler-free, just kind of impressions of what I read this week, didn't really have any major problems with what I read this week. There were some entertaining moments, some concerning moments, just on a moral standpoint with one particular character, which we'll get into over these first couple of chapters. Actually, the last couple of chapters that I read this week, chapters 35 and 36, were surprisingly packed with stuff going on, and really, like, that's all I think I really need to say at this point. There's been some pretty large developments. Like I said, the last couple chapters were pretty eventful. There's some stuff going on that was nearly climactic, but not quite. I'm very curious to see how it is that Jordan plans to actually finish the book in just 90 more pages after this, given what just happened to Rand characters, in particular Rand's character. I've been misspeaking like this for several days now, where I just put the S's at the ends of all the wrong words. I have no idea what's been going on. I apologize. I think it's just stress and stuff going on. That's basically all that I really need to say for the spoiler-free at this point, aside from the fact that I believe these first couple chapters of the reading, chapters 28 and 29, are Matt POV. You have like 3 chapters that are almost entirely like Elaine and Nynaeve stuff. You have a chapter in between that's kind of something different, and then you have a solid like 4 chapters that are Rand and Min stuff. Great to get actual Min POV this week as well. I really enjoyed that. Let's start off in the actual spoiler-filled portion with chapters 28 through 29, which, like I said, are Matt POV stuff, in which chapter 28 begins with Matt and all the people that have been following him having just moved into the Terracin Palace, following, of course, what we read last week that involved Elaine and Nynaeve inviting them over to actually stay in the Terracin Palace instead of the inn that Matt has hitherto stayed at. Is that how that word is used? That Matt has up to this point been staying at. Instead, in the Terracin Palace, Matt comes across Tom and Sandar. Just a little brief interaction between them here, where Matt doesn't really learn anything more about what it is that Elaine and Nynaeve are actually doing here in Ebu Dar. It doesn't seem like Tom and Sandar really know for themselves what it is that they're exactly doing. The only thing that the other 2 guys have really learned and are able to tell Matt is that Elaine and Nynaeve have figured out how to disguise themselves using the One Power, and are therefore able to leave, exit, kind of run off from the palace at random times without really having any particular guard or protection or anything like that, because they're disguised, so nobody really notices when they come or go sometimes. And of course, we know at this point in this particular chapter, the reason that Elaine and Nynaeve are not in the palace right now is because they've just been at the house of the kin. As we learn a little bit later in the reading for this week, actually, is that the group of women that are not Aes Sedai that Elaine and Nynaeve confront and try to get information about the Bowl of the Winds from in last week's reading. That group of women is called the Kin. And that's where they've been at this chapter, and that's why they're not at the palace in chapter 28 when Matt goes looking for them. But the girls do come back over the course of this chapter, and when they come back, they seem to be a little bit overly friendly with Matt in some ways. They basically give him a task instead of, being the other way around. Matt basically agreed to come over to the palace if, he's allowed to give them bodyguards, require them to have bodyguards, and that they do what he says, but they're able to kind of get him a job, give him a task rather, of watching a particular house, which would be the house of the Kin that he is basically tasked with watching for whatever reason. So this is something that he ends up doing for however long. It's not a horribly long time, but it's like a few days or something, it seems like. Maybe even a couple weeks. It's not really entirely clear how much time goes by, at least not to my reading. It just seemed like you're jumping through various scenes of Matt going about a new form of daily routine. All the while, Matt kind of has to combat some problems of his own in his personal life, namely, most primarily, Queen Tai Lin at the palace, basically fawning and chasing over him, and actually kind of assaulting him to one degree or another. Depending on how sensitive you are to that material, you're probably going to be very offended by this stuff. And I kind of had a discussion, not quite argument per se, with a friend over the weekend after I had read this kind of stuff, in which he seemed like this material was handled pretty poorly by Jordan, even though it's not meant to be, making fun of it or making levity out of this type of situation. But I didn't really feel like it was doing a poor job of any of that. I felt like it was actually handled pretty good, considering the POV and Matt kind of working in denial and just kind of having to deal with it, trying to deal with it in the way that he knows how based off of his personality. I thought that the material was handled actually pretty well, all things considered. But I can see why some people would have issues with this particular content, because Matt has to deal with advances from the Queen, like I said, which is only really interrupted by Tom and Sandar coming to his room and obviously stopping this little whatever's going on. There's various scenes of Matt kind of being implicitly starved by the Queen, because the Queen's really only preparing food for him if he'll dine with her, therefore, so that she can make more advances upon him. And he basically refuses to, so he has to eat elsewhere or find other ways to eat, because none of the kitchens, none of the cooks, the chefs, or whatever of the palace are making food for him unless he's going to dine with the Queen directly. So there's a lot of like I said, kind of assault related stuff going on with Matt sexually from the Queen that is a little uncomfortable in some ways, but I didn't really feel like it was handled very poorly, in my personal opinion. So there's that's going on. Chapter 29 sees this happening a lot worse, because at the beginning of the chapter, Matt's trying to take over the boy who won the the horse race in an earlier chapter. He's trying to take over, who he sort of is partially under or a guardian of, I guess you could say. But Over is escorted to the Festival of the Birds, which is the title of the chapter, kind of an event that's happening in Ebu Dar. Over happens to be escorted by a maiden of the Queen instead, while Matt's trying to take him himself, because Tylin happens to get her way with Matt in this chapter, in which an actual assault scene happens, and Matt's not very happy with it. He's not comfortable with it. He's very... yeah, it's not a great scene in that not good content. Queen Tylin is obviously not a very good person here, quite obviously very predatory. That's the word that I've been looking for a good bit now. Very predatory stuff, and yeah, it's questionable content. But again, like I said, I didn't feel like it was handled very poorly, in that I don't feel like Robert Jordan was making levity or making light of the subject at all, whereas a friend of mine did feel like it was not handled as seriously as it was supposed to be. But, we can agree to disagree on certain stuff like that. either way, that does happen in the chapter, and it's like, yeah, Queen Tylan is not a great person at all, not even a little bit. But when finally he does manage to get free from that, he is able to attend the festival, accompanied by Nalisian, if that pronunciation is correct from a previous comment on a previous diary. I guess that's the guy's name. Something. It's more, probably a better pronunciation than my piss poor attempts in the other video that I happen to try to say it in. But Matt is accompanied by him and Birgit and Beslin as well. Beslin is Tylan's son, of course, whom she basically required in an earlier chapter for Matt and Beslin to attend festivals and dances and stuff together, because reasons, basically, is why this is a thing. The group ends up in a pretty large scuffle in this chapter and a brawl with beggars before they kind of escape down the road. I wasn't entirely clear on like when or why this actually happened, but it does happen nonetheless. Another thing we learn over the course of this scene, Matt's interactions with Beslin. Matt doesn't really want him to know, obviously, that his mother is having an affair with him, and more so that Matt is not very happy about it. But Beslin does know and also approves of it, kind of the way that a lot of the palace kind of approves of it, in the sense of like, oh, Tylan's got the hots for Matt, and that's, you know, the queen's prerogative. And like, I don't know if that's actually okay, to be honest. But that is how it goes. Like I said, Beslin does know. Matt's not happy about it. He kind of like flees the scene, sort of. It seems like he does, kind of saying flippantly about if he doesn't return or something, that like the girls are on their own searching for the bowl or some. I don't know what it is specifically that he said, but it didn't make much sense to me. You then have a short scene at the very end of this chapter, which switches POV to Rianne. And the other women of the circle interacting as well, not really finding evidence of Nynaeve and Elaine being kind of out and about around the palace, so Rianne kind of assumes that they haven't told anybody about the kin, that they haven't revealed any of the kin's secrets or what little they were able to find out, just kind of existing, that kind of stuff. Obviously, of course, Nynaeve and Elaine were not watching the kin's house directly. That's what they had Matt and some other people doing instead, so there's where that kind of ties into the plot a little bit, I suppose. But they still consider sending much of their own number out of the city, lest the secrets happen to be spilled anyway. That was a very short scene at the end of the chapter. But then we move into chapter 30, and like I said, chapters 30, 31, and 32 are a lot. Well, that's a lie. Chapters 30 and 31, actually, just these two chapters. Okay, so I guess I was mistaken about the chapter counts before. Chapters 30 and 31 are largely Elaine and Nynaeve stuff, moving into their perspective. Chapter 30 is called The First Cup and begins with Elaine basically being interrogated and abused by some of the other Aes Sedai in Abu Dar. So basically is kind of a reaction of some of the stuff that she's telling the Aes Sedai based off of the kin, and wanting to learn more about the kin, telling them like what happened at the house of the kin. This is the scene basically where we learn that they're called the kin, unless it was revealed at some point earlier in the book, in which case my bad for forgetting that. When Elaine receives a letter partway through this kind of interrogation that she's going through, this letter seems to be from Caridin, and was given to her through Tylan. The letter says that Elaine's mother is alive and with Commander Niall of the White Cloaks. Of course, Caridin is a White Cloak, even though he is a Dark Friend. He is a White Cloak, ostensibly. Elaine feels like she has reason to doubt this letter, and she does definitely have reason to doubt this. It is more or less true, even though Niall's dead now. Morghese was alive, or is still alive, and was with Niall for a good period of time. So even though the contents of the letter were correct, I understand why Elaine wasn't willing to believe the information coming from Caridin as a Dark Friend, or as a known Dark Friend to her anyway. She kind of decides that she's done being toyed with, being played with by other people. She burns this letter, just using the one power in the scene. And she also is kind of further... The other Aes Sedai attempt to further abuse her, further scold her, I guess would be the proper term, for using the one power in their presence without their permission, before kind of treating her like a novice still, maybe even an accepted, but basically still like a novice. This, young girl, obviously, as Elaine still happens to be at this point. But Elaine, like I said, is kind of done being toyed with by other people. And so as a reaction to this, being scolded by everyone for everything at this point, kind of takes command of the situation by using a commanding voice type of trick that Morghese happened to teach her as a kid, and also reminding the Aes Sedai that she is a full sister, actually, not a novice, so the way they're treating her isn't really proper in that sense, and that Elaine is also the most powerful among them, and therefore she technically is the one who should be in charge, quote unquote, of the entire group here. I found this scene to be pretty entertaining and enjoyable to actually experience. It was like, yes, Elaine, use your power, stop being treated like garbage by other Aes Sedai just because you're young. I enjoyed that, especially after the chapters with the kin, in which the kin would really just refuse to let her say anything without, disbelieving her outright, which I found to be a little bit frustrating in last week's reading. Not that it was necessarily a bad thing or that it didn't make sense, but more so just because I found it really irritating. I think that, absolutely, utterly refusing to listen to a single word somebody has to say, and while they're still trying to just get a single word and you're just interrupting them the entire time, I find that kind of behavior just really aggravating. That's the reason why I didn't really like that before. So in this scene, for Elaine to actually turn the tables here and say, no, actually, I'm the strongest amongst you here, you all need to shut up, was kind of enjoyable. I found that pretty entertaining here. Following this display of power, obviously a couple of the other Aes Sedai, Vandene and Adeleas, the twins, happened to they actually offer information about the kin and kind of tell Elaine a little bit about what's going on with them, and about the fact that the tower has actually known about them for a while, but that's sort of a tower secret for some reason and wasn't something that Elaine had been made privy to prior. Something that she should have known, that she should have been made privy to because of being a full sister, but which she just now found out in this scene. Next, the rest of chapter 30 follows a little bit of a different scene from Moghedien's POV, following presumably Nynaeve through a part of Ebu Dar. Moghedien just kind of happens to be here and recognizes somebody. Like I said, I don't think it's confirmed in this chapter yet that it's Nynaeve. We know by the next chapter that it is her, but Moghedien is just like, oh, I recognize that person. I know I'm not really supposed to make a scene because I'm, serving the Dark One in whatever way it is that I serve the Dark One now, but I see this channeler here, and she captured me, or rather defeated me in one way or another at least twice now. I'm not going to let her have the opportunity to do it again. I'm going to destroy her. So Moghedien is following Nynaeve through the streets of Ebu Dar, watches Nynaeve get on a boat that with a red cabin, notably, is the detail that she uses to remember which boat she's on. She uses some compulsion powers to have a random innkeeper show her to the roof of an inn, where Moghedien uses balefire to destroy and sink the boat with the red cabin that Nynaeve happens to be on. She misses the cabin, so isn't able to destroy Nynaeve directly, but she does hit the boat and causes it to sink, and then she flees the scene. Moghedien knows basically that her use of the power using balefire would have drawn enough of the one power that basically anybody in the city who can channel to any degree or sense the channeling of the one power would know that somebody just used an extremely potent amount of it. And so she leaves very quickly to try to get out of that situation before anything bad happens. Chapter 31 switches us to Nynaeve on the boat just as the balefire hits and sinking, which is basically the confirmation that it was Nynaeve that Moghedien was following, because I don't think in chapter 30 it said quite so explicitly. I think it's more or less implied, but chapter 31 does confirm that for us. Nynaeve unsuccessfully attempts to anger herself to be able to get out of the sinking boat, because part of the problem that she's facing in the boat is that she doesn't really have a way out of the cabin, out of whatever it is that she was stuck in. So she's trying to anger herself to be able to use the power to a degree that she can kind of free herself to, destroy part of wherever she's at so that she can actually get out and not drown to death. Doesn't work. Like I said, it's pretty unsuccessful. Instead, you have a scene here where me just telling you what happens isn't nearly as effective as it is in the book. Pretty rare moment of me having to specify that, because like it genuinely was a really awesome scene in which Nynaeve finally like relinquishes her pride and relinquishes herself to just accepting whatever happens. It's just like, okay, I give up. I don't really have a way to do this. Just up until now, Nynaeve has had to be really mad in order to actually be able to channel. This is called a block, and blocks are typically things that a lot of wilders happen to experience. Wilders are people who use the one power or who have to learn how to use the one power kind of on their own, whether subconsciously or not, because they haven't gone to the tower or haven't been properly tested or trained with the power in the White Tower. So Nynaeve has had this block, and in fact, the last couple of books have featured a number of scenes in which other women are trying to break Nynaeve's block in one manner or another. I believe the Fires of Heaven had a lot of this going on. If I'm not mistaken, I think the end of the Fires of Heaven especially had a lot of this stuff. Lord of Chaos probably had plenty of this as well. All I know is that this was definitely something that was going on with her. But this, Nynaeve finally like relinquishing herself to the power, says, like, I can't get out of here. I'm not able to anchor myself in order to do this. I just need to let this go, and it breaks the block, which I thought was pretty cool. Like I said, just telling you kind of what happens, and it's probably a misexplanation to some degree as well. Just telling you what happens doesn't really actually tell you how effective the scene was, because I found it to be quite effective. And just as, you know, she relinquishes herself, the one power happens to be used. It just channels naturally and breaks herself free. Not necessarily by her own intention, because she had to relinquish herself to this first, and that was pretty cool. Following herself breaking part of the cabin to make herself free, she's kind of trying to get out, but she's too weak, doesn't really have enough oxygen at this point, and it turns out that Lan has finally arrived. Lan is here and actually saves her from drowning, drags her out of the water basically after she frees herself. The two of them kind of reunite pretty hilariously, in my opinion. I found this rebonding between them to be pretty entertaining and pretty funny, not least because Nynaeve continues to be her stubborn and kind of annoying self to some small degree, even though I don't find her super annoying at this point. It's just funny how they reunite, and that like Nynaeve is just so relieved that like he's here and he's around and he's alive, but she also like smacks him about because of the fact that he can't be her warder immediately at this point. He's still the warder of whatever her name is. I've already forgotten which Aes Sedai was, which name it is. There's too many names in this series, man, and most of them don't matter enough to actually recall for longer than 2 seconds while they're not on the page. Either way, Lan is somebody else's warder, even though Egwene has said that Lan is to be Nynaeve's temporary warder until that bond can actually be transferred properly. Lan is here. Nynaeve basically promises that he will be her warder, even though Lan kind of tries to explain to her that there's certain aspects of losing more Moraine that makes, you know, transferring bond like being, you know, a like loving, caring partner or whatever, that kind of makes some of that stuff difficult. Nynaeve doesn't really care because, you know, she loves Lan and wants Lan to be her warder anyway. Like I said, the reunion was kind of funny in some ways, pretty emotional in other ways. I just found it to be really enjoyable to read about as a rule. And obviously Lan is her temporary warder until the bond can be transferred properly. But yeah, really cool scene with Lan both reappearing for Nynaeve in that way, and also Nynaeve breaking her block finally. That is great. That means that, you know, the rest of the series is probably going to feature some pretty cool stuff with her magic-wise. Anyway, following all of this scene, we move on back to another Elaine scene in which she and the other Aes Sedai, in which, you know, she kind of took charge of in the previous chapter, they infiltrate the Kin's house here, confronting the Kin personally, in which Elaine kind of offers them the opportunity to join Egwene as the Amyrlin to be able to train in the White Tower to learn how to actually be Aes Sedai again, whichever ones are able to do that, which is something that these women, the Kin, like graciously accept, because they were afraid that the Aes Sedai were here to basically destroy them, because Elaine initially says just like, no, we've known about you guys for a long time, actually, even though Elaine hasn't. The White Tower has. You know what it is that she means here. Elaine offers them the opportunity to join Egwene and to be an Aes Sedai again. they basically accept here, the circle of the kin here, this little grouping of women in the room in which they infiltrate, basically accept in the name of like some nearly 2,000 of the kin that exist, which is an absurd number. I think the chapter said somewhere in there that it's something like twice as many or more than twice as many actual Aes Sedai as there are right now. So if any substantial amount of them are able to become full Aes Sedai and actually be powerful channelers, like that's a huge boon for the Dragon Reborn at the last battle whenever Egwene's part of the White Tower is able to eventually, support him, because that's presumably what's going to happen. Who knows? The chapter or the series could definitely do some pretty weird things in here. Rianne is just about to tell the women as well, because Elaine insists, just like, no, we know, like, we'll offer you this, just let us know where the Bowl of the Winds is. And Rianne is finally about to tell Elaine and the others where an Angreal storeroom that they have is at. Whenever the women all sense some channeling from below them, it's from another kin whom Matt has had to deal with, because he's at the house again now for however it is that he got here from the last chapter. Presumably something happened in there, but Matt is here as well. Matt tells Elaine what Rianne was just about to tell them as well. It's just like, I know where this stuff is. It's like at this other place. It's in another storeroom or something. Like, I've basically found you the Bowl of the Winds. And Elaine's like, yeah, we know, Rianne just told us. So there's that interaction in there. Elaine also gets Rianne to state her age at the very end, because, of course, there was an argument between Elaine and Nynaeve earlier in the book about how old Rianne could possibly be. Apparently, Rianne is 412 years old, which is like a massive shock. Why it is that this is a shock, I'm not entirely sure if I'm understanding properly or if I'm like really getting it. But like, that's pretty old. It seems like that is older than even a significant portion of Aes Sedai, maybe. I'm not entirely sure, but it is pretty old. So whatever it is that causes that, that's something that I'm sure we're going to explore to some degree a little bit later. Some note that I actually made here at the end of these notes, referring back to the Nynaeve and Lan stuff going on, that like I said, I kind of forgot to mention, is that Lan's eyes are as cold as Winter's heart. They're described as being cold as Winter's heart or some such in there, which I found to be interesting, considering that book 9 is called Winter's Heart. No idea if that's called that because of anything to do with Lan or any of this plot line or whatever. Who knows? I just thought that note was interesting. Moving into chapter 32, we have yet another pretty major POV shift. We move back into following Elida's POV for, I think, the first time since the prologue, if I'm not mistaken. So this was a pretty big shock, and I looked forward to reading the chapter when I discovered this, and I had good reason to look forward to it, because it was good material, it was enjoyable, and some pretty big material happening here as well. Elida is awoken at the beginning of the chapter by Alviarin, of course, her keeper, because of some Aes Sedai called Kovarla returning from trying to capture Rand and bringing him to the tower. So I guess Kovarla was part of this embassy of Aes Sedai, I guess, who she's apparently, the chapter says, and I don't know if I got this right, the chapter says she's one of 12 Aes Sedai who managed to return from a total of 39 Aes Sedai who had initially gone on this embassy mission of sorts, this mission to capture Rand and bring him back. If so, that seems like a really overkill amount of Aes Sedai, like 3 times as many required to be able to gentle a man wielder. So that's interesting to find out. But if those numbers are correct, if I actually understood and interpreted those numbers correct, that's not very many Aes Sedai to return. Of course, some of those Aes Sedai would have died. Some of those other ones would have been stilled. Many of them would have been captured and are like in the under the watch of the Aiel Wise Ones from Rand. And then, of course, you have all of them that were forced to swear fealty to Rand following Doom as well. So there's all that stuff. Kovarla tells of the failure of the operation, everything that happened all in that sequence of events, and that all the other Aes Sedai were captured or killed, basically, is kind of the gist of what happened there. After Kovarla is sent away, after, telling Elida all this information, Elida is essentially bullied, albeit somewhat indirectly, into submitting to the Black Aja by Alviarin, because Alviarin has her own things that she is essentially trying to force Elida into doing here, because we know that Alviarin is Black Aja. Even though Elaida doesn't know she's Black Aja for sure, Alviarin basically forces Elaida to submit to her, which means that she's kind of submitting to the Black Aja for some of these things that she wants them to do. Elaida's given orders to carry out the very next morning after all of this happens. Orders such as targeting 2 specific greens who have harbored Angreal to some extent, punishing them pretty harsher than seems to be normal. Elaida kind of instinctively understands that there's something more to Alviarin than what she previously knew, what she previously understood. She worries for her own future as the Amyrlin because of some of this stuff, and also because of, you know, some of the foretelling that she experienced. Like, was any of that foretelling stuff talking about her as Amyrlin, or was it talking about somebody else? Elaida's not quite too sure at this point. Either way, Alviarin is pretty confident that she has Elaida effectively under her thumb for Messiana, as we have a slight POV shift into Alviarin here at the end of the chapter. But then you have another scene at the very end from yet another character's POV, Siane's. Siane's? Is that how you pronounce her name? Siane's POV. She's the sitter of the White Aja at the White Tower for here. Elaida goes to her, asks her basically to route out the potential for Black Aja up to and including Alviarin anywhere in the tower. Elaida's kind of understood, like I said, that there's something more to Alviarin, and like maybe that's Black Aja or something like that. And Elaida tells Siane is basically go through, it's just like, if you find anybody who may not be actually following the tower here, like route those people out and deal with it, sort of. And like I said, this basically suggests the Black Aja, particularly. Siane takes this information and goes to Pavara, another Aes Sedai who is the sitter of the Red Aja. These two Aes Sedai happen to have been longtime friends. Pavara also happens to have experience with Dark Friends. Apparently some of her friends and family have been murdered by Dark Friends over the years, so Siane goes to Pavara to ask for help in this task, fearing basically for the entirety of the tower, because if there are Black Aja, and if they're actually real, and they've got to route them out, and especially if Alviarin happens to be one, because Elaida put in no uncertain terms that, like, you should go up to and including the Keeper in this search. Yeah, that's pretty severe material at this point. Yeah, pretty eventful chapter. It was a good one. I enjoyed that. But after chapter 32 came chapters 33 through 36, so all of the chapters that regard Rand's and Min's POV here at the end of the chapter. And man, I gotta tell you, I was hoping this video would be significantly shorter than the last couple of these, and maybe even all 3 of the videos for Crown of Swords so far, and that is not what's turning out to happen. I'm sorry, I apologize. I really don't know why it is that these ones are so much longer than any of the diaries for previous books at this point. Either way, chapters 33 through 36 were what finished out my reading and were Rand and Min stuff. Really enjoyed the material in here. Chapter 33 featured Rand being pretty ashamed of himself, being pretty unhappy with himself for supposedly forcing himself on, as he sees it, forcing himself on Min. Min makes very clear to him in, you know, this moment that she willingly participated in, of course, the lovemaking that the two characters had after Min came to Rand when she had found Culliveri's hanged body, and then of course after Rand had already heard about Herod having been killed as well, so like this sort of tragic event that became a lovemaking scene. This scene is kind of the aftermath of that and was pretty entertaining as such. Rand admits to loving her basically, and also to Elaine and Avienda. I think he's kind of trying to do this not necessarily to hurt Min, but to like make it clear that like there's some complications in this affair, and Min obviously doesn't really care. She's kind of already come to accept that she has to share Rand with Avienda and Elaine. Min says that she also loves Rand and that the other girls love Rand, that she somehow knows this, even though pretty sure Min hasn't even met Avienda at this point, which is kind of funny. She tells Rand that he kind of needs to get over this, you know, kind of situation, that like it's all going to be okay. Min also reveals a previously untold viewing of that she's experienced with Rand of two men, one of them whom she kind of implicitly knows is Rand, but she can't really like say for sure which of the two men is Rand. She sees two men coming together, basically, one of them dying in this sort of merging sequence. One of these men is Rand, the other one is presumably Lews Therin, following in Rand's POV, like he kind of knows, like, that's probably Lews Therin, we come together, one of us dies, one of us gains control. However that's going to end up going in the series, who knows? But because this viewing happens, we're pretty sure that this is going to happen because none of Min's viewings have really failed at this point. There's one that she feels like has failed, but that's like the only exception, basically. And it might not even be an exception, depending on how you view it. Either way, Rand knows that the men are he and Lews Therin, and, you know, one of them has to die in order for this merging to occur. So he's basically, the interesting part of this scene is that Rand takes this viewing as like confirmation that Lews Therin does exist, and that Lews Therin isn't just a figment of Rand's imagination, that they are like actually battling in his head, isn't just a voice, it isn't just him going crazy. So that's something that kind of recurs over the next couple chapters that Rand has to tell Min. It's just like, look, I know I'm not mad, I know I'm not crazy, because the voice that I have in my head, you confirmed through that viewing that you told me isn't just a voice, he's an actual person that we kind of have to merge at some point in time. So there's that going on. Min also finally convinces Rand that he needs to see the sea folk who've been kind of waiting around near Carrion for a little while. So he's like, okay, I'm going to actually finally do this. And that's how that chapter ends, because chapter 34 is where Rand actually meets with the head of the sea folk traveling to them, including one called Hareen, who speaks for the mistress of the ships, which I guess means that her word kind of binds to all Athenian mirror ships, to all of the sea folk ships, that whatever it is that Hareen commits to regarding Rand is kind of requires the participation from all the other ships. It's kind of a social custom or something along these lines. During the course of these kind of meetings with the sea folk, Rand demonstrates that Aes Sedai serve him and treat him as kind of this chosen one, since the sea folk have their own chosen one prophecies, not like the Dragon Reborn, not like the Kara Karn. They have the Koramor. Basically goes to them saying, hey, like, I'm the Koramor, submit to me, basically, is how that goes. Rand, being Ta'veren, kind of surprisingly, or rather not surprisingly, depending on how you look at that, causes Hareen to agree to / sort of say more that she intends in this meeting with Rand. Min has a viewing at some point in here that Hareen will be punished for what she commits to on this specific day, committing to Rand, but that she will one day be actual mistress of the ships instead of just speaking for mistress of the ships. Whatever the distinction in the political structures of the sea folk there is, not entirely sure, but that's a distinction that I felt like was important to make, even though I'm definitely going to forget that distinction by, next week, let alone by 15 books from now. After Rand has kind of gotten some, commitment to some degree from Hareen, he leaves Marana and Raphella, a couple of the Aes Sedai who have committed, or rather, who have submitted to him. He leaves them there to stay to negotiate with Hareen while he leaves, because he is actually going to use the Ta'veren power that he is experiencing in the last chapter, in which it's actually been making a good influence on people, been, working in his favor on his side. He uses chapter 35 to insist upon visiting with Min. They go about this alone. They visit a camp in the wood of rebels of Carrion. So, camp in the woods outside Carrion. They're found in these woods outside Carrion after Rand does a little bit of traveling with Min here. They're found by Caroline Damodred, so a cousin of Moraine's, which is interesting. And shortly after that, by Tyr's High Lord Darlin, who seemed to have left Tyr at some point and kind of like escaped something or other that was coming to him under Rand. I forget off the top of my head. But either way, both these characters come upon Rand and Min in the woods. Min sees a viewing of a crown over Darlin, which is probably something important, meaning that Darlin's probably going to have some form of like a kingly glory at some point somewhere for whatever reason. Not entirely sure, but that is something that Min sees here, because chapters 35 and 36, for the record, switch over to Min's POV rather than Rand's. So I guess I should clarify that. For some unknown reasons, it seems like Caroline Despite Rand revealing himself to her as the Dragon Reborn, as Rand al'Thor, Carline hides his identity from the others because obviously Rand's, amongst the camp or amongst members of the camp of Carrion rebels, people who want to put Carline or some other people on the throne of Carrion rather than, Rand temporarily holding it, waiting to be able to give it to Elaine. For some reason, Carline pretends that Rand is her cousin, naming him Tomas Trakand. Of course, Trakand is the last name of Elaine. So that's interesting because we knew that Elaine is like kind of sort of technically related to Moiraine somehow. At some point in one of these books, we figured out that like there's some relations there that like puts these two as being like distant cousins to some degree, which was a really interesting reveal. Like I said, Caroline Demodred introduces Rand as being a cousin, Tomas Trakand, and Min as being his husband. Rand's cavernness basically is able to get them to travel all back to the actual rebel camp, in which Darlin kind of spills the beans about some of his own feelings about Rand, some of the things that Rand did to him back in Tyr. So some of these relations, the irony of him saying this to Rand directly. Caroline reveals info about some of the people in the camp and kind of what's going on here in the rebel camp to Min as well. Not entirely sure what it is that Caroline's actually doing, like where she actually stands is kind of confusing. It's not entirely clear. Like I said, not so sure what's going on, but that's okay. In the camp itself, when these people get here, is a character called Torem Riatin, who is another conspirator against Rand, obviously being, in the camp of rebels. Alongside Torem is Paddan Fane, identifying as Mordeth. Rand, like, really kind of scarily threatens privately that Fane is a dead man, having, recognized him here. That was an interesting moment. Moving into Min kind of turning around at some point in a tent in the camp here and finding that Cadswain happens to be in the camp for some reason. Cadswain is introduced to the guise of Rand al'Thor as Tomas Trakand, even though Cadswain just had met with Rand not too long ago, several chapters ago, as Rand. So, like, Cadswain obviously knows that this isn't who Rand is, but she goes along with it as well for some reason that we can't quite tell at this point. She and Rand kind of make subtle threats or the like against each other, whatever those threats are and like whatever they imply. At this point, I have no idea. Torem interrupts all of this, interrupts Caroline telling Rand to leave because, like, kind of the introductions happen, characters kind of move away. Caroline tells Rand, it's just like, you need to get out of here now because these people figure out who you are. Like, you're going to die. Like I said, I don't know why it is that she's actually helping him, but she is for some reason. Even so, Torem happens to interrupt Caroline telling this to Rand and kind of challenges Rand to a duel, which Rand foolishly accepts at the end of the chapter here. Chapter 36 had quite a few events with Rand and Torem beginning a duel in the tent until the tent kind of seems to disappear. A portion of the camp disappears. The entire encampment is kind of surrounded or I guess filled with some form of like fog, and there's something in the fog. Something in the fog steals away one of the Red Sisters, one of the Darius Aes Sedai that just kind of happened to be here. Of course, like Cadswain's here. There's a couple others, most notably the other one that is around these parts. What's her name? Samitsu is the other one who I feel the name is actually important to mention. So there's several of these people here. Rand, Min, Torem, Darlin, and like I said, some of these other sisters, including Cadswain, kind of form a defensive group within the fog, whatever the heck is actually going on here. Cadswain continues to refuse to reveal Rand's identity, and again, I have no idea why she's doing this either. Like, I'm kind of confused by the motivation. Not confused, I'm very intrigued by the motivations of some of these characters here. Rand, at some point in this defensive maneuver, uses a little bit of balefire against something that's in the fog, which kind of reveals himself to Torem and Darlin. Torem runs away, accusing Rand of being why the violent fog is kind of present in the first place. Cadswain slaps Rand for using balefire, just like, no, don't do that again. We're not supposed to use balefire. So that was You're not supposed to use balefire. Padan Fane emerges from the fog a little bit and wounds Rand where his old previous evil festering wound that he's had in his side for so long at this point. I don't even remember when it was that Rand acquired that wound. It's been so long. Padan Fane emerges and happens to wound Rand again over that very same wound. Supposedly these two wounds are like kind of like separate evils working two different types of like dark magic or something against him, and they're also like kind of trying to fight each other to some degree. Neither of them is fully healable by Samitsu, who happens to be a yellow Aja Aes Sedai who is here. She's like, my power definitely isn't enough to be able to do anything with this, but you know, they all, you know, gather Rand and try to escape the fog, which they do eventually escape the fog. Darlin happens to be carrying Rand because this attack against him, this wound, basically knocks him unconscious. Min is pretty distraught by this as well for obvious reasons. The whole group hires a particular farmer who happens to be on the road and hires him to take them to the Sun Palace where Rand can get some form of treatment from somebody. Cadsuane wanted to take him somewhere else first, to be able to heal him with like some other Aes Sedai or something along those lines, which Min had said, like, don't do that. Like, let's not do this because if Rand wakes up next to a bunch of random Aes Sedai who he doesn't know or recognize again, that could be a very bad thing. Obviously, Cadsuane is pretty inclined to ask some questions about this because, you know, what exactly does that mean? And it's because Min explains that the last time this happened was at Dumai's Wells, and that's why Dumai's Wells happened. So she kind of goes over a little bit of that story. When the group is actually at the palace, it seems that several people try to gather to Rand, despite some of Cadsuane's orders, just like nobody needs to come in here and disturb him. But some of the other White Tower Aes Sedai happen to be around anyway. These other Aes Sedai who swore fealty to Rand are around. These other ones happen to know Cadsuane, kind of the way that all the Aes Sedai seem to know Cadsuane as a sort of legend. When these Aes Sedai enter and, you know, are kind of dumbfounded to find Cadsuane here and are sent away for one reason or another, some of the Ashaman happen to arrive, most notably Dashiva with another one named Flynn. So these are like two of the three Ashaman that Rand retained when he forced Taim to take all the rest back to the Black Tower. Apparently Flynn has some talent with healing and Dashiva doesn't, but Dashiva orders Flynn essentially to heal Rand, and Flynn does. He does it by kind of like separating off these two evils, these two powers that are working, trying to kill Rand, these two powers that can't really be fully healed. He's like kind of able to like separate them off, like kind of shield them from Rand so that they're not attacking Rand as purposely, and also so that they may or may not attack each other to maybe kind of counteract each other to some degree, maybe destroy each other. However any of that stuff works, who knows? All we know is that that's kind of what's happened. So Rand's a little bit better because these two wounds are no longer like attacking him directly. Samitsu, the yellow Aes Sedai, is desperate to learn how it is that the Ashaman did this, including saying things like, I'll bear your child if you want, if you just teach me how to do this, which I thought was a hilarious line. Very funny to see an Aes Sedai kind of break composure in some way like this, but that's basically how the reading for the week ended. Like I said, these last couple chapters were pretty eventful. Not necessarily climactic per se, but for Rand to kind of infiltrate a rebel camp, or something to happen for Padan Fane to be there, to be attacked and, you know, basically made unconscious again out of nowhere. Like, makes you really wonder what in the world is actually going to be the end of this book with only 90 pages left. And if I'm not mistaken, there's only one Rand chapter left, and it's the very last chapter of the book. I might be wrong about that, but there's only 5 chapters left nonetheless, and I know that at least 2 or 3 of these are like Elaine and Nynaeve related stuff. So I'm really interested to see what it is that Robert Jordan actually does with the book moving forward, but I'm excited to finish it nonetheless. That is what I'm going to be doing over this coming week. So thank you for watching this video if you did. Again, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to make this any shorter than the last couple of these. Like, I don't know why they're so long all of a sudden. I was thinking that this book would be like the start of a trend in which I could have fewer diaries and them all be shorter, and like, no, apparently there's going to be the same amount of diaries and they're all going to be way longer for some reason. Even so, I hope you've been enjoying yourself as you've been following my journey along with the Wheel of Time. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys next week in the final diary for A Crown of Swords.